Look, I think one of the great mistakes we make in our lives is that we radically overestimate the amount of work that we can do in our 20s and 30s and radically underestimate the amount of work we can do in our 40s and 50s and even 60s and 70s. So society tells us, or professional professors, et cetera, that if you want to be a success, what you've got to do out of the gate is work, 18-hour days, right? Sort of nonstop. And we have lots of examples of people like, Elon Musk, hedge fund guys, et cetera, who it seems become titanically successful working these enormously long hours. The problem with that is, number one, there's a huge body of science that tells us that we are not effective for 14 hours a day, but we are effective for several. And then the rest of it is struggle and performative. So whatever you think you're going to be sort of learning in a day, you're mainly going to be learning in the first five. And the longer you work, the less likely you are to remember that stuff, whether it is, whether it's medical procedures or tacit knowledge or cultural stuff, or that'll be overwhelmed by sort of the fatigue that comes from struggling through being in the office at hour 12. All right. The other thing, though, the other part of sort of the challenge is that we underestimate how much we can do sort of later in life. The assumption that we're going to be incredible successes when we're young implies that we cannot be successes after that. Again, what the brain science tells us, what the biographies of lots of very successful sort of creatives and even entrepreneurs tells us is that every single one of us has continues to have a terrific capacity to be creative, to have new ideas, to do great work into our 40s and 60s. I think that buying into the assumption that we need when we are young to work these amazingly long hours in a kind of arms race against our own self-destruction is something that benefits our employers sometimes. If we're working for places that have sort of a really good treadmill of recruiting people from universities, working them insanely long hours for 3 years, and then replacing us with sort of new people from the same schools. But in the long run, we're going to have better lives and do better work if we recognize that even in our 20s, we are not exempt from the laws of physics and physiology, and that later in life, we're capable of doing just as impressive things as we are in our youth. So I think that is something that many of the people in my book, Rest, kind of learned the hard way. A lot of them worked super hard and then had a nervous breakdown or something at 35 and realized, I need to make a change. And these are very smart people. These like Nobel Prize winners and stuff. But the sooner you can recognize that, the better. But whenever you recognize it, it's not too soon to make a change and to begin to work differently and work better.
Two things that came up for me, and thank you for sharing that. The first is, I think the subtle pressure we feel to be so successful early on is, to me, directly correlated with the social media. And that's the benefit pre-internet. Everyone who was creative or young and working towards something, they didn't have that exposure. They had no idea what the majority of people their age were up to and talking about. They had this benefit of ignorance almost, right? That unless they were in contact through letter writing or whoever lived around them, they just were like, well, I think it's cool, I'm going to do it, right? And I think this incessant need to compare, even I find myself someone that is successful my age, I'll try to find out their age, and it's like, what's their exact age? Where are they at now? And I think it's just this really toxic thing that corrodes our ability to be present to the authentic vision of our own life and the pace in which that unfolds, to your point about it not being upfront. I think the second thing that comes up is a hot take, but I almost wonder if it's almost always beneficial to bypass the ability to be successful when you're young for two reasons. One, to give yourself time to build more foundation for a sustainable life. But two, that actually so much of the ego and let's say the underdeveloped psyche is so at play that you said this, we have a higher chance at self sabotage than we do at self care. And our ability to almost bypass the need to have these exposures, to prioritize our relationships, to prioritize finding meaning and having a slower pace that's built on a stronger bedrock sets us up for success later in a way where when we're successful later, we're not as worried that that success is tied to who we are, which is something that I personally struggle with, and I think many people do.
That's well put. And I think it is worth recognizing how radically novel and how new the idea that we need to be, successes when we're young, and that the only opportunity we have to be sort of successful is in our 20s and 30s really is, right? Certainly our agrarian ancestors had no conception of success that follows the model that we do today. Success was a good harvest and maybe acquiring a little more land or a slightly larger flock. But even, in the 20th century, right, 60 years ago, we had a model of success that assumed that, like the heads of General Motors and General Electric, for two guys named Charlie Wilson, who literally both started in the mail rooms of their respective companies and worked their way up to the corner office, that professional success was something that happened often in one company where you paid your dues, you worked your way up, and eventually you reached the top, versus this model that begins to emerge mainly, I think, in the 1980s with two things. One is the rise of Silicon Valley as a kind of career model. And second, the rise of Wall Street and financial engineering as sort of an exemplar of what wealth looks like. And the Valley and Wall Street taught us that the way that you get rich is by working these insanely long hours before the next crash, and or the technical skills that you've acquired at MIT or Stanford become obsolete. So you now have this very narrow window in which to prove yourself, to make your money, and or to get out. But for the overwhelming majority of us, careers don't look like that. Professional development doesn't look like that, right? You can, as if you're a lawyer, you can read a lot of words when you're 25, but you make much less sense of them than when you're 45 and you've been doing this for a while. I think likewise, I would expect that, decades from now, as good as you are with your clients today, I suspect you'll be even better in the future. And that's how it works for most of us. We have been, we've been dazzled by this vision uh, of the 30 under 30 list or world's youngest billionaires. And we've confused the prominence of that as proof that this is how we all ought to strive and how all our lives ought to unfold. And just as all our friends are not actually hiking in the Cascades or hanging out in Corsica right now, despite what Instagram tells us. Likewise, of our careers are not ones that are characterized either by phenomenal success or total failure by the time we're 35.
Yeah, it brings up for me a stat that I had a friend who works at Harvard and researches how we work. He mentioned that the U.S. is really the only country within the group of let's say the countries with the highest GDP. I forget there's a name for them. There's an acronym, but essentially he goes, we're the only ones that really have a negative view of non-college or non-white collar jobs. If you go into the trades, if you take a gap year, if you pursue something creative, then you missed the boat and maybe you weren't so smart and you didn't work hard enough or you didn't figure out what you wanted to do. And there's this overemphasis that college is kind of like the one-way ticket to success. And if you don't pursue that, then you're a failure. And not only that, as we've seen in the results of people doing that, it's not producing good results. And I think to your point, we need to normalize that everyone's path is different. The point is that you don't just, again, jump right onto a path that someone else, including your parents, told you to take, Because ultimately, if it's void of meaning, if it's void of direction and purpose, it's actually not going to serve you. And by taking the time to really have that strong sense of self that's not tied to it, and to me, a good metric of that is how often do you talk about your actions and like what you do and your work versus ideas, virtues, and the embodiments of what's going on. It's so interesting, right? We live in America where we say, how are you doing? We always say, I'm good. And then we regurgitate things we did in the last week, action
Mhm.
wise. We just do not get to the deeper sense of self and the things that really make up the meaning of life, which I think is interesting.
Yeah. No, I think you're quite right. It is, we need to seek out, I think, those opportunities to reflect more deeply, but I think they absolutely can pay off. And if it means that you have some epiphanies that mean that, at 35, you don't have a lot of money to sort of to psychiatrists after or therapists after, you've sort of burned out and crashed your, sort of crashed your company, but instead you've lived a life in which those things haven't happened and and you don't need that. That may be a pretty decent trade. Most of us will only be able to reach that or of second track if we think about it in advance, right? If we that as you said, if we think about what is meaningful and sort of what matters so that we can then plan and act and make decisions accordingly.
Most men in their 20s and 30s treat rest like a weakness or even a threat, something you earn after proving yourself through exhaustion, burnout, overworking. You've spent years studying how rest actually makes us more productive and creative. Walk me through the moment you realized our entire relationship with energy and recovery is backwards, both societally and for most of us as an individual.
The origins of this project really were, there were two things 20 years apart. One of them was a class that I had as a freshman on titled Invention and Discovery in the Arts and Sciences, which was about the psychology of or creativity in looking at the lives of everyone from Leonardo da Vinci to sort of Einstein or sort of abstract, expressionist painters. And that raised a set of questions that I've really been sort of dealing with ever since. But one of the things that that class did was we spent a lot of time looking at how people worked, whether that was in the studio, the laboratory, elsewhere. But we never asked the question of what things outside of periods of labor themselves sort of contributed to sort of making for sort of great lives, either in sort of the sense of being creative and accomplished, or in the broader sense of sort of having lived a good life. But around 2011, I had a sabbatical and was at Microsoft Research in Cambridge and had spent the last 10 years or so working in Silicon Valley. I'd been working for a nonprofit, sort of think tank. I kind of burned out on that and had an opportunity to go to England to do some research to kind of reset. And so, about halfway through the sabbatical, my wife and I were sitting in a cafe that we liked to go to in the evenings. And I had this epiphany, which was that I was getting enormous amounts of stuff done. I was reading a lot. I was writing again, having great conversations with really brilliant people sort of during the day at the lab. But I didn't have the kind of sense of being perpetually half a project behind or sort of always under the gun. That was kind of part and parcel of my work back in California with, or of very often extremely interesting clients working on pretty neat stuff. And it made me wonder that, maybe the assumption that in order to sort of do really interesting work, the sort that I was sort of rediscovering, that actually we're always taught that in order to do this stuff, you have to work enormously long hours or to personal sacrifices that are just kind of part of the job or the profession. And that in a sense, success is a sort of foot race against burnout. Right? The question is, which one are you going to sort of reach first? My experience at Cambridge made me think, maybe this is actually backwards. Maybe in order to do sort of really good creative work, it was necessary to sort of actually slow down. And this is an idea that kind of wouldn't go away. I wrote another book sort of in the meantime, but it was one of those ideas that just sticks with you. And so when I started getting into it and going back to some of those lives that I had studied in that seminar, I realized that these actually were people who spent an awful lot of time pursuing serious hobbies. They were amateur painters or musicians. They often were sort of pretty good parents, even in the 18th and 19th century when this was not necessarily something that men were expected to do. And they went on long vacations and sort of long weekends and did all sorts of things that we all easily think of as antithetical to sort of success or as markers not of being serious about one's place in the world of commerce or to professions, but rather as something less noble. And
Yeah.
but furthermore, that these are all lives that had certain common patterns in how people worked, how they rested, how they chose their leisure, chose their hobbies. And the fact that they all wove them together in similar kinds of ways made me realize there actually was a story that was really worth telling. And that's how rest came to.
I think there's a few things in there that kind of struck me. I'm curious if you can speak to. So you mentioned amount of time not working versus working. You mentioned leisurely or let's say non-outcome, non-income based activities like hobbies, etc.
Mhm.
And then you also mentioned, the societal structures, both at the time and currently, obviously, Europe being a little different than the US, though both westernized. I'm curious, are we bound by the systems at play in our modern day? Because when we think about, especially America, and you have predominantly, let's say, hyper successful people in terms of how much money people make or how successful they are in their given career, but then you also see that extreme given in how much we tend to work. Especially you being in Silicon Valley for all those years, that's like the 1% of the 1%. So I'm curious, how can the average person approach rest, learning from people in the ages, as you mentioned, considering things like how much time off and vacation, leisurely activities, that kind of thing? And to what extent can we personally express, meaning how much control do we really have in light of how successful we can be in those things, considering the way of our institutions and systems are set up?
That is the central question that lots of people sort of have, and indeed was part of what drove sort of my work on the 4-day work week. So you use the term bound by social conventions, professional expectations, etc. I think it's absolutely the case that we are highly influenced by them, but it is possible not to be bound by them. To respect them, but but still to be able to find sort of something different. How can the average person approach rest learning from people from of the 19th century or of other periods? Well, there's no evidence that human evolution has changed kind of energy demands or circadian rhythms and so on in the last 200 years. So we'll start with that. That and I think that the people I looked at in rest who were mainly, and they all were highly successful, accomplished people: scientists, musicians, composers, lots of Nobel Prize winners, famous authors. I have a chapter even that talks about sort of Dwight Eisenhower and sort of generals during World War II. And I think that these are often people who have a lot of control over their time and whose lives we have really good records for. So you can think of them as essentially a kind of creative or productive elite, right? Under a set of fairly ideal circumstances, what kinds of lives do people with a lot of control over their own lives develop in order to sort of maximize or realize their ambitions, maximize creativity, and so on? And what you find are these patterns where, first of all, people are working super hard for about 5 hours a day or so. And all the rest of their time is organized to support those periods of deep work, even to the as going as far as making choices about where you're going to live and who you will marry or whether you will have families. It will be shaped by the desire to sort of to shape your sort of working opportunities. So, but working about 5 hours a day, but not 5 continuous hours. It's about working about 90 minutes to 2 hours, broken up by periods of sort of rest. And so what they're doing is layering periods of the focused work and deliberate rest, several stacking these and doing several of them. That constitutes sort of the core of their workday. So you also see consistent or patterns in the kinds of hobbies they choose, the amount of leisure that they have. A lot of them take naps at some point during the day, and there are reasons for that are both sort of creative and energetic. What I've just described is a kind of ideal that if you are potentially working from home, you might be can potentially begin to sort of implement, right? The thing about the stacking periods of work of hard focused work and rest, shortening your workday, that's something that if you are working for yourself, potentially is something that you can sort of think seriously about. If you are, on the other hand, if you're working in an office, you're working in an organization, then you can start by doing some other things. And I think that the two critical ones are thinking more mindfully about protecting your own personal time, right? And basically nights and weekends. These are people who thought a lot about their work, but that didn't mean that they were working all the time. And one of the key things that they all realize at a certain point in their lives is that you actually can have very good ideas when you are not at the lab bench or at your desk, but you have to create the conditions for having these unexpected moments of insight, these sort of intellectual breakthroughs. And you can in fact design your day and design your life to have more of those rather than fewer. And protecting nights and weekends is an important part of that. Just as expectations around sort of long hours and overwork are basically signals that we get from society or come from the structures that we encounter at work and are shared with colleagues. So too are the solutions that will help us create more rest in the workplace, ones that need to be created with our colleagues. The challenge of finding ways of working that won't burn us out, that will make us and our organizations more sustainable, are ones that we have to solve together rather than ones that we can solve by ourselves. So, long answer to your question, but I think that we can recognize and therefore begin to push back against the kinds of assumptions that sort of structure our work, especially when we're young. That the patterns that I talk about in rest offer a kind of basic template for a sort of ideal for how we can redesign our days, and that ultimately doing it with others is a great way to make it sort of more sustainable, to share it with everybody, and to turn it into something that benefits both us and um, our colleagues and employers and everybody.
That's really helpful. And it sounds like, if I'm understanding correctly, that whether you are working for yourself or an organization, the more reasonable autonomy you have over your schedule is helpful, meaning you can create some more boundaries when you start and stop work, because there are sprints or periods of time that seem to be more optimal to work, is the first thing. And the second, that if someone's listening and they are bound to a classic, let's call it 9 to 5, you're saying they still have a lot of autonomy before the workday starts and after. That's almost just as important to really key into and be thoughtful about. And that thirdly, this speaks to the unfortunate isolation we're seeing present day, but it takes working with others, talking to your boss, to your colleagues, to the people that you live with, to try to renegotiate and collaborate on how to better rest individually, but also maybe collectively. And something that comes up for me as you're talking about this is just the rampant use of screens, which I'm sure you're well aware of and probably have included in considering in your studies. I think on a few fronts. One, people that work a non-labor based job now have 24/7 access to work, essentially, right? So a lot of my clients in therapy are saying, Wes, I'm sure I get off work at 5 and I end and I spend time with my kids, but then I go back on because email, right? My boss says, well, can you check that or do that? So that's the first thing. But let's say even if you're not using the screen for work, I find it's so striking how much the average person really looks to a screen for rest time. And I'm curious if you can speak to maybe a better way to rest. Many couples or individuals binge watching TV shows and movies, and then sometimes while they're on social media scrolling, right? And it just seems so overwhelmingly present in people's day-to-day life, both in how much screen time they're having in general. So maybe we start there. What are the general effects of how much screen time we're ingesting? And then two, what's a different way we can engage with screens in a way that feels more restful?
Those are great questions. So I think you are quite right that if you are at a gas station or the bank or sort of in line anywhere, you look around, what are people doing while they're waiting? They're checking their phones. And this is we have, in the span of what is it now, about 20 years since the first smartphones came out, gotten into this point where looking at a screen is like the default activity that people do when they're awake. So it's not just when we are at work, but also in our off hours as well. I think that this is thinking of this as rest is, or as sort of recreation, depends a lot on what you're doing. But I think that the broad answer is that defaulting to checking social media or sort of TikTok, etc. This is, it is certainly diverting. But if you think of rest as the time that you spend recovering the mental and physical energy that you spend down when you work, there are better ways to rest. And in particular, I think that we underestimate the restorative benefits of physical activity, whether that is something as simple as walking that turns out to have all kinds of benefits for us, or whether it is more elaborate stuff, going to the gym, going for a run, etc. The important point being that very often the most restorative kinds of rest, especially for people who are super busy, who are in high stress jobs, or in jobs that have a degree of unpredictability about them. For those people, the best kinds of rest are active rather than passive. And that over the long run, that will those kinds of rest will pay off in terms of better mental capacity, aging better, generally being sort of healthier, less prone to chronic disease, sort of, et cetera. How can we now so how can we do this differently? I mean, I think in the sort of at the personal level, the first thing you can start with is thinking about changing up your relationship with sort of your smartphone, which I think for most of us is like the sharp end of the spear in terms of sort of digital distractions. And there are a couple things that you can do there. One of them is to recognize that our phones are, in their default state, are designed to be maximally intrusive, maximally distracting. And so the first thing to do is to get a handle on that. And that involves a couple things. Number one is silencing as many alerts, notifications, etc., as you possibly can. The second is thinking about who really needs to contact you and when. I think of like the zombie apocalypse test. right? In the zombie apocalypse, who do you need to be able to call and who needs to be able to reach you no matter what? That probably is going to be a pretty small list, right? And for me, that is my wife, my kids, and a couple other people. And for them, I have given one ringtone to people who pass that test. And that is the opening bars of Derek and the Dominoes' Layla. Because no matter what I'm doing, I hear that great Greg Allman riff, and it is Greg Allman who wrote that, not Eric Clapton. No matter what, I'm going to hear that and I'm going to know, okay, that's someone who matters. That's something that or if I'm going to pick up. Everybody else, in contrast, gets a little Yo-Yo Ma solo Bach cello concerto. And it's something that I will notice, but I don't have to pick up on. I can make a decision about. And that goes, for me, goes a long way to make it, to my phone from something that is constantly trying to erode my attention to something that helps to or to protect it. And I think that knocking back all those notifications thinking, creating that whitelist or zombie apocalypse list for people trying to call. Those are valuable things. Another important one I have found is keeping my phone in my bag or in a different room when I'm working, right? When I need really to be heads down, just having the thing literally physically out of reach helps a lot to help keep me focused, keep me on track. I now even have like an egg timer that I use for, timing my Pomodoro or deep work sessions rather than using my phone, because just having that physical separation for me increasingly is a valuable thing. And I'm someone who studied this stuff an awful lot, right? And so even if, and despite that, despite knowing the research, knowing the people who've done the research, I still have to be really conscious and thought about the strategies that I use for this super, super useful, but also incredibly distracting thing. And so, but if you can get a handle on that, then you can reclaim a whole bunch of time that you can spend more sort of mindfully and sort of with better results. I think, and then I think that the one other thing though is that you can't control by like redesigning defaults and putting your phone away is the expectations that other people have about sort of whether you're going to be always on and always accessible. Now, whether your boss is going to sort of email and expect a response, that night. And this is much more of a social thing. But again, it is less, for most of us, less a function of the globalized 24/7 nature of late capitalism. And again, more a default that we sort of fell into. Smartphones, when they first came out, were supposed to make it possible for us to break our work into chunks during the day so that we could work when we're most able to. We're able to deal with family things, and then we can at other times sort of return to work sort of free from the bounds of offices and with a traditional 9 to 5. What's happened instead is that work is kind of ground down into this fine powder that's kind of blown across our entire days. And and our bosses, just like us, have grown up in a world where the assumption is because we are capable of being always on and always accessible, we must, thanks to our technologies, we must also be always on and always accessible. But it turns out that this is an urgency that is actually manufactured rather than real. So there's a lovely book called Sleeping with Your Cell Phone by a Harvard Business School professor named Leslie Perlow. And it talks about an experiment she did with a big consulting firm in Boston where people took one evening off per week and didn't answer email, didn't have to do any work. They were dealing with big problems with burnout and retention. And so they felt that this was maybe a way to address that. Some of the senior partners worried, the earth is going to crash into the sun. We're going to lose all our clients because we're not answering email immediately. They still tried it for 6 months. And they found that not only were people happier, burnout was down, retention was up. They did a survey of clients, and clients hadn't even noticed that they were not getting replies that night to or questions. And so I think that one of the big takeaways there is that we often do not occupy quite as much space in our clients' minds as we think we do. Work that matters to us is not always urgent enough to require instantaneous sort of responses. That being a little more mindful about sort of when we reply and therefore carving out a little more time for sort of family or for ourselves has real demonstrable benefits in terms of burnout, retention, even quality of work and creativity. And so, just doing something as simple as one night a week creates a set of win-wins that are good for employees, good for us, good for the organization, and don't cost our clients anything. Of course, if you're working in an emergency room or someplace where there are genuine emergencies, then your mileage will vary. But as the saying goes, it's PR, not an ER. Most of us are doing something closer to PR than we are doing something that sort of really requires sort of being always on and always active, and that we'll have better lives and do better work if we recognize that and sort of design for it.
Yeah, I think what's coming up as a really major theme in all that, Alex, is the really crucial need for setting boundaries and protecting the things that mean the most to you, starting with your relationships, as you mentioned with the apocalypse analogy. I love that, and I'll be using it. And then working your way out. And, I think when we talk about what we value most outside of relationships, it really is our energy. There's a lot of conversation now about seeing your energy as a budget. I've heard it said like body budget. How much do you have to spend each day? And thank goodness we are starting to see even productivity more like how we manage energy. But when we think about energy, you mentioned these different facets, that it's not just physical energy, though it's good to hear that constant movement actually has a lot of benefits, even for someone that is constantly at a high functioning job where they're not able to move. But, it expands beyond the physical. There's a whole other layer: mental, emotional, spiritual. And I'm curious, I feel like people have this innate pressure to say, well, I have to do this, I have to do that. And to your point, that's just what we've been conditioned to. I'm curious if you can speak to, let's start on an organizational level, how people can start to consider why 4 days might be a better setup than five. And then, two, on an individual level, how we can apply that to our everyday lives, essentially mitigating the amount of more immediate, I would call it fight or flight responses, right? We have this sense of, well, I have to get to it, right? If I don't get to it right away. And I think what you're getting at is we really have to poke at our justification for how important something actually is versus our perceived sense of importance of it. So, anyways, yeah, I'd love to hear your take on your work in 4 day work weeks, why that may be a better setup than 5 day. And then let's get into the personal boundaries one can set outside of the phone, but certainly starting there, as far as how we can start to live a less urgent, reactive life based on those boundaries and protecting that energy in the different facets of energy.
A 30-second argument for adopting a 4-day work week is the following. Studies tell us that the average knowledge worker loses something like 2 to 3 hours of productive time every day to overly long meetings, to distractions in the office, and to poorly implemented technologies and workflows. So the 4-day week is actually already here. We're just spending an extra day sitting around in meetings, trying to fix the printer and talking about last night's game. So if you can get a handle on those three things, the technology, the meetings, the processes, you can actually go a very long way to making a 4-day week viable. Now, if you're working in retail, if you're working in some place where you've got a service level agreement that says you've got to be open 40 hours a week, there are lots of different ways that organizations have found to accommodate that, right? It's not you're working Monday through Thursday and then everything goes dark necessarily. Some places will do shifts, they'll set up rota systems, you've got someone on call. When you say 4-day week, it's actually like saying electricity. There are lots of different ways to implement this in workplaces that or of work for everyone, yourself and your clients. The benefits are that you get a better functioning organization that's more resilient, it's got tighter workflows. It's a way of encouraging people to think a lot about how they work and to give them a clear incentive to work better, not just individually, but as teams. It also promotes a more kind of transformational style of leadership rather than merely transactional, as well as having benefits in terms of improvements in retention, professional development, creativity, etc. It also, by the way, comes at virtually zero or of cost financially. Nobody is having to put in whole new IT systems or something, right? You're just using the technologies that you have a little more sort of skillfully. For individuals, how to apply some of these lessons to our everyday lives. And in a way that helps us back away from the sort of fight or flight mode. I think that the first thing within the workplace or within our sort of daily work that we can do is sort of play around with implementing these periods of deep work and rest. Sort of doing that stacking. And what the research tells us is that most of us are capable of sort of working in a really capable of concentrating really hard on something for up to about 110 minutes or so before sort of we need a break. There were different studies that say 52 minutes followed by a 17-minute break is ideal. Some other experiments say about 110 minutes and then about a 20-minute break. Um, I think that, let's say so. However, doing that serves to do a couple things. One is, it gives us an opportunity to sort of reset, sort of mentally. It's an opportunity also sometimes to, get up, move around, get the blood circulating. If you're doing it with others, like if your entire office has these periods of deep focus work, that's even better because it means that nobody is distracting anybody else. Everybody has time to do work that really matters to them. And there's a kind of social contagion effect. It's a little bit like going to the library during finals, right? You're not necessarily studying with other people, but being in the presence of other people who are really focused helps you focus better. And I think that one of the benefits of that kind of deep work and of thinking consciously about your time in this way is that this offers a first step towards dealing with that fight or flight response. Because when you are more thoughtful about how you're going to spend your time, gives you a greater sense of control over it. It gives you the ability to say, all right, let's take a moment. Let's think about the really critical things that I need to get done in this day, which means that you're not just reacting to what everything is at the top of your inbox, but you've made a choice about what you really need to focus on. You're taking back control both of your attention and control over your time. And you cannot underestimate how important that is for doing better work in a way that both increases your productivity and sort of reduces your stress level. Now, and if you're in a job where you really can't do that, right? Going back to the emergency room, you can't predict whether the next person who comes through has the flu or has been in a car crash. Under those circumstances, if you're really doing that kind of work, then again, protecting your time off, having better boundaries between sort of your work time and your personal time, that is going to be the really essential thing because getting that sense of control, sense of mastery over your time, having that in your off hours is going to be important, both on its own, but also because that will create the space for doing something other than just scrolling through your phone and create time for you to think about how do I want to spend this time that really is going to be sort of more sort of restorative and more enjoyable so that when I go through those hospital doors on Monday, I'm going to be able to perform well rather than struggle from the first hour.
Yeah, I think that sense of control is a big component here and something I'd like to dive into because this podcast is primarily for men and exploring how we can mature my sense is we're starting to see a real dichotomy and extremism in guys that are either really top performers, right? They're working really high functional jobs, they're in committed relationships, and they have kids, and their time is extremely strapped. It's like very constrained, and a lot of times, especially, if you do have kids, it kind of, as it complexifies things because they don't necessarily follow your agenda all the time outside of work. And then you have this other side of many guys that are underperforming and really giving into, this is a more harsh way to say it, but more hedonism, the porn weed video games kind of stereotype, but guys who are overindulging in screen time, underperforming in school and work. And you kind of see this, yeah, tension being held. I think if you're open to, I'd like to hear you speak to kind of both use cases. So if you're a guy that feels like, man, like I hear what he's saying, I really want to implement these. And maybe I'm selfishly more in this category, right? I have a 19-month-old son. We have another on the way in January. I work full time. And I think, gosh, like I constantly find myself with, I'm privileged to have a lot of autonomy over my therapy schedule. But then there's those bookends, what you're talking about, the morning and evening tend to be pretty committed to obviously caring for other people and taking care of things. And when I'm done with that, it feels like I'm tapped of energy. So maybe speaking to what are some things a guy in that first category can do. And then maybe as well in the second, hey, I have so much time on my hands. It feels so existentially meaningless. Where do I even start as far as how to start taking control of my energy and properly placing it?
Okay, so I think first of all, sort of mazel tov on the sort of next kid coming. I think that you know, I will say that having having small kids, dealing with them is the hardest thing you will do in your life. I think that I mean, both of mine are now in their 20s, and looking back, it was really there was almost a 10-year period where I uh, where I was spending more of my energy sort of on them and sort of less on other things. And it was exactly the right choice, right? There is, I think, nothing as rewarding ultimately as that work. But the reality was that, in the limits that we all have as sort of human beings existing in 24 hours, that there are hard choices to make about how much you can devote to these different things that matter to you. And it is okay for kids to be first and something else to be second, because that's not going to last forever. They're going to grow up. They will at some point, let's hope, not stop speaking to you, but sort of require less of your time and attention. At which point, you're going to be able to sort of return to sort of other things that and sort of and probably make up sort of lost make up time. I when my youngest was, what would it have been? I think 10. Sort of my second book came out, and so really from about the time that he was 8 years old, I started being able to get back more time and being able to write more seriously. And I wrote one book in the time that the first 10 years of sort of being a parent, and then in the next 10 years, I wrote three. And so that's some indication of like how much on the back end you're going to be able sort of to do once they get a little bit older. To think about work life balance, not as something that happens over the course of a day, but really happens over the course of years or seasons, right? There are times when one of these things is going to matter a lot more than others, or times when you really have, genuinely no choice about prioritizing this one thing over something else. But these things do not last forever. And I think that if you're conscious when you're making those choices to prioritize kids, to prioritize sort of work, and maybe not make it to every baseball game, but you are clear with yourself about why you're doing that and when that will end, right? Once I've, after after you make partner or you get somewhere else in your career, then you are going to sort of change things up and sort of redesign your calendar and spend more time doing other things. if you can be thoughtful about that and hold to that, then I think that you can make better choices sort of across your life that will sort of serve you well and still sort of respect the needs of sort of the people who you love. I think that in a sense, this is, the distinction between type 2 fun and type 1 fun. Climbers and outdoors people talk about this, that type 1 fun is stuff that is fun in the moment. Type 2 fun is like, is stuff that is fun after it's over. So, you're out camping and and the thunderstorm comes and stuff gets soaked and you've got to pack everything up and sort of hike back down from the site, and it's cold and it's rainy and it's terrible, but once you get back to a cabin and it's warm, that was really a great experience. That's type 2 fun. In a sense, we're talking about sort of a model of life being one in which you've got to make a bunch of choices, you have to be a little ruthless, and a certain amount of it is going to be type 2 fun rather than type 1, right? Type 1 is playing Call of Duty for 10 hours a day. Now, so I think that the other important thing as a parent with kids who are now in their 20s is that it is important to do two things as a parent. One is to be available when necessary, but also to not assume that your kids actually need you every second of their waking lives, right? I think that we get all kinds of signals from society about the moral imperative of overparenting and being overprotective. And I think, honestly, women have dealt with this for decades, if not centuries. The novelty is that men now have to deal with it too. The more reasonable thing the attitude that I took, and my kids turned out very well with this, was, look, as a parent, you're going to be in like the top 25% of sort of human parent performers if your kids don't end up serial killers, they don't die of some easily communicable disease, or they don't end up child soldiers, right? It's not necessary, if you're a good parent, for them to get early action into Yale or Rice or whatever, to be in 14 different activities, etc. If they're healthy, if they're reasonably happy, if they sort of and they are and they are nice to other people, that's most of your work right there. So you don't have to spend the additional 80% of time trying to get the last 20% of fine tuning, so that they so that they are like first chair violin, or you know or the star of the Nutcracker. There's if they love that kind of stuff, then yes, support it, but we should recognize as parents that kids need plenty of us, but not all of us. So now, as for guys who are underperforming and not doing very many things, where do they start? I think there's actually, a serious, that's a serious challenge. And I think that the simple answer is, most of us really get meaning in our lives when we find something outside of ourselves that can matter to us, that can give order to our days and help, and give us some purpose. And this is why some of my younger cousins, sort of went into the military after sort of graduating from high school, or people choose to do sort of other challenging things. I think that these days, the number of incredibly easily accessible, super diverting things that are the cognitive equivalent, basically, of opioids, is a real challenge. But how do you find that? The first answer is, you find it with other people. Where do you find those other people? Is that's going to vary a lot depending upon sort of who you are and sort of where you are. But most of us, when we're young, are going to find will find that purpose we'll find that outside of ourselves. And so, but unfortunately, there's not like a single place to go that to sort of to figure to solve that challenge.
There's a real pressure of performative parenting, do I have the right gear? And like you said about the schools, and I'm in the Boston area, so I'm hearing that all the time, right? If like my kids too, what's the IQ? How can we, put him or her on a track to be successful? And I just appreciate how you brought us back down to saying there are just foundational virtues and aspects to child rearing that we just need to focus on and keep the main thing the main thing. And then to the second point about guys that are, let's say, wasting their energy, that how important it is to start with meaning. And I think that's a great question to end on. I think we're in a meaning crisis, as people like John Vervaeke have named and started speaking to. And, my understanding of the brain is essentially, your brain will default to the thing that costs the least amount of energy to do in a moment, unless it already has a plan. Like if you already say, here's the meaningful things in my life and here's how I'm spending it. Let's say for me, it's picking up my son from daycare, right? If I don't have that responsibility or time block in place, I probably will just go on YouTube or, check sports or whatever. So, yeah, I'm curious when it comes to legacy and meaning, the deeper stuff. As you mentioned at the beginning of this episode, there have been creative icons across centuries, men who have built their lives around achievement and productivity and creativity, but in the modern day, often neglect recovery, which is the big difference in men in the 19th century that you mentioned. So, what happens to a guy's capacity for the work of his life, let's say capital L, that actually matters, the relationships, the meaning making, the things that, they'll remember on their deathbed?
Hmm. I think that the first thing I would say is that the capacity to do the work of your life is one that extends for a much longer period than society teaches us. We live in a world and an economy, here in Silicon Valley, where 23-year-olds are working hard to make 25-year-olds feel obsolete. And it is, we make choices about things like, deferring becoming a parent or deferring getting married on the theory that the years between like 21 and 35 are a kind of rocket ship where we are uniquely positioned to acquire wealth, to accelerate our careers, etc. That is less about sort of innate capability than it is about sort of the way that careers and structures and professions are sort of designed. What science tells us is that certainly our brains change across, let's say, the period from about 20 to 60, but we don't get stupider. What happens is that the mix of things that we're really good at, there are things that happen with sort of short-term memory versus judgment, or that sort of that me, but the like we are, unless you are doing, basically, unless you're doing manual labor, right? Like you're a lobster fisherman or something, that your capacity for doing work that matters to you is going to extend for or functionally virtually across your entire lifespan. Part of what and lifespans are getting longer. So part of what that means is that we should think about a long game and we should play a long game. And part of that should be don't work less in ways that will burn you out early on and sort of just and destroy your love of the thing that you think you can do for decades. Instead, think about and find these ways of working more sustainably so that you can do this thing for 50 years rather than 5. And I think that taking rest seriously, or beginning to put it into practice, using these tools of sort of the stacking focused work and deliberate rest, these are things that will help make it possible for you to do great work for decades rather than just for years. An important part of that is retaining the capacity of having a vision of who you can become and developing the capacity to reach that goal. My mother, sort of the last couple of years of her life, developed dementia. And one of the things that struck me most powerfully about this uniquely cruel sort of disease is that it robs you of the capacity to make plans and to ever become anything better than the person you are at this moment. right? As it progresses, you're only going to get worse. And what struck me really forcefully was that there is a this is one of the great divides in our lives between these periods when we are able to make plans, to have a vision of ourselves in the future and to be able to work toward it versus losing that capacity. But the important thing is we have that capacity for much longer than we expect, than we normally imagine. We have the ability to continue to improve into our 70s and 80s. One of the things in rest that's really remarkable is that a lot of the people who I talk about did their last work, like published their last book or had their last exhibition when they were like 75 or so. This is, and there's so practicing work and rest in this way is something that I think pays off over sort of the very long run. I think that also, and so we neglect recovery, we neglect rest at the expense of our later selves, at the expense of our capacity to get satisfaction from work that otherwise we could do for more of our lives. And therefore, if you want to have a life that has meaning, that has purpose, that sort of includes things that will give you sort of a sense of satisfaction at the end of your life, looking back over what you've done, then sort of both working and resting in a more mindful and deliberate manner, and maybe helping a few other people in your circle, whether it's colleagues, employees, what have you, to likewise sort of work in this way, will pay off immeasurably over the long run and over the entire course of your life.
Mm. Well, first, thanks for sharing that personal story about your mom. I'm just really struck by how true that is. And it sounds like for any young guy listening who's, just out of college or starting his career up to, mid 30s is this kind of paradoxical approach, which is don't just jump into something really quickly, wholeheartedly, and just blow past rest and recovery and sacrifice relationships, which can include marriage and kids potentially, and then think you're just going to wake up at 35 and now start those things because you'll probably have an existential crisis. And two, you've missed a big portion of a foundational building skills to set you up for long term success. But then the other side of that paradox is, to your point, as you start to be mindful about what you participate in, have a vision that is worth giving yourself to holistically in a sustainable way, meaning don't hold back on giving yourself fully during that period of time, let's say about that decade from age 23 to 33, because it's just as important to give yourself fully to the things you absolutely know are meaningful and worthwhile learning, such as rest and recovery and what comes to our minds and our hearts within that space. And that really is something that every man can do no matter what kind of job you work. And it's something that is not optional to consider. So Alex, thank you for your time. It's been such a joy just hearing the insights, everything from practical to what guys can actually do day to day, to more existential, the things that we can consider, reflect on, and things that I know certainly I'll take away. And I'm curious where people can find your work.
So I've got a couple books that where people can dive in much deeper into all of these sort of topics. The first is just called Rest: Why We Get More Done When We Work Less, or Why You Get More Done When You Work Less. It's only been out for 10 years. Anyway, so there's Rest. My book about the 4-day week is called Shorter: Work Better, Smarter, and Less. And my consulting company is 4dayweek.studio. And that has, among other things, sort of a free version of the program that I developed for national trials in the UK, Australia, North America, sort of, and elsewhere for organizations to design 4-day work week trials. You can see how this organizations think about these issues, how they do their strategic planning, etc., so that you can figure out whether this is something that you can try on your own or maybe bring to the attention of sort of your bosses. And then if you like pictures of cats and dogs, I'm on Instagram at Ask Pang. That's pretty so. And finally, also Ask Pang is the handle for my Substack. That's pretty much everything about sort of for my online presence.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. Looking forward to diving more into your work. And I know with a lot of the frameworks I'm developing, yours is something that I'm definitely going to start including and have now realized just how essential it is to thriving, of course, in general as a human, but particularly how you frame some of these things for young men. So thank you again for your time. And guys, until next time.
Thank you. It's been great, Wes.